Good morning. I hope everyone got some rest last night and is excited for another day here at the workshop. I'm Kim Wood. I'm on the organizing committee and I will be your MC today. I hope everyone online can hear me all right. And since we are just about at the top of the hour, I'll go ahead and get us going. We are diving into storytelling today. I'm super excited about that, both from a communication perspective and a teaching perspective as a professor. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to kick us off here with Susan Jasko. So Susan, take it away.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm short. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all, and those of you online, howdy. And I am really pleased to be in the position this morning to kick us off, because this idea about storytelling and narrative is one that I've been interested in for a very long time in my own academic career, my own professional development. And as the windy path my career eventually took landed me over here in the atmospheric science end of the world, coming from a communication studies background, I became, in a way, interested in it in a new way, right? We might call that science communication, or the communication of science to a certain extent. But also because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, misapprehension about what is meant by storytelling, and how it actually functions. So here, I'm sorry for, I think I'm famous perhaps for changing the titles of my talks by the time I actually get to speak. And so there's my clever The Story of Story slide. And how narrative coheres information and knowledge. And that's the part I really want to help you understand better. I think that for a lot of folks who don't come from a humanities/social science kind of background, story sounds like something you tell children. They're a form of entertainment, and surely they are both those things, right? But the reason they're such a powerful form of entertainment, the reason we use them with children, is because they have this incredible function in the cognition and the understanding of humans, right? They are how we understand the world and our experience and our place in the world. So that is not frivolous, it's not extra, it's not just entertainment. So those of you who know me for a while probably realize I cannot do a talk hardly without a quote from Mark Twain. So I found two of them. Let me see. And one is the one on the left. The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. And if you've spent any time in San Francisco in the summer, you know what he's talking about there. And of course, Mark Twain is celebrated as one of America's greatest storytellers himself, right? But his stories were a lot more than just stories, and also he made a living for a long time being a sort of inspirational speaker, for lack of a better way to characterize him, where his wit, his powers of observation and his wit were the things that always sort of gave the punch and made his stories memorable. And he noticed in another moment that in the spring I have counted 136 different kinds of weather inside of 24 hours. Now, while he may be exaggerating, though he would tell you he wasn't, indeed, right, that's pretty substantial powers of observation about what was going on in the world around him. Okay, sorry, my fingers weren't working. All right, so when I first wanted to think about storytelling in the atmospheric sciences, I Googled storytelling and weather, and lo and behold, this is one of the first things that popped up there, and because it says right at the top, weather story, right? Now, I think that this is not necessarily the form of storytelling that you would necessarily be using, right? So how many of you are faculty in the room? And online, I can't see you anymore, so I'm going to assume and assume any number of you are in fact faculty, right? And so I don't know if you've had the same experience I had as faculty for a long time, which is that I discovered that for students to really get something I was teaching them, to really understand a concept, right, that I was working with, that if I could build up a narrative, an example, right, as a way to introduce what I was going to talk about, or experience with that concept, right, from my own professional or personal experience, that those were things they held on to a whole lot better, right, than other things. So if we look at this just for a moment, right, we see the headline, Strong Thunderstorms This Morning, and as a communication professional, I can say to you, bravo, right? If that's the only thing anybody reads, that's what you want them to know. And that's a lesson well worth taking away, right? That whatever you're communicating, in whatever form you end up doing it, that there be a succinct, significant, coherent idea that you want people to take away. Now, we could talk more about the graphical layout of this and whether or not the positioning of everything is best in terms of emphasis of what you want to emphasize, but I think we will move on from here. So I want to talk more about how humans understand the world and how we think and why stories fit into this in a good way. So I've titled this slide Sense and Meaning Making in Humans, and I chose that particular image for a number of reasons. But take a look at the quote by C.S. Lewis. How many of you know C.S. Lewis' work? Fiction, right? Okay, famous. But, he was also a professor and very much with a philosophical background, right? With background in philosophy and theology. And so I like that quote for a number of reasons. He says, reason is the natural order of truth. I'm going to leave that part of the sentence alone because that would be a whole day's seminar talking about what that actually, like what is truth, how the philosophers are. Okay, so I'm going to leave that over to the side for the moment. But the second thing, but imagination is the organ of meaning. When I first read that, it just stopped my brain. I was just like, wow, what an observation, right? What an observation that meaning arises, right, from humans in some act that we have to make happen, right? He's referring to imagination here. We could call it other things as well. Look at that photograph, right? Look at that image. How would you explain what's happening in that picture? That's a real question. Thank you.
Structured chaos.
Structured chaos. Wow, why the chaos?
I say that because, the lowest tier of chairs near the floor looks more organized, and of course it would because they're on the foundation. But as you increase the number of chairs on top of the pile, it becomes much more chaotic. And you're looking at that, and you don't really see any order in it, but it's standing.
Implying there must be some kind of pattern, or right, so there's some structural integrity, right? There, if I work with engineers, forgive me, about what's happening there. And I think you look at the figure, and he's holding up a chair, right? And I think, so is his problem, is it like Jenga in reverse? Is his problem like, how do I get this chair on that pile? Or is that a chair he's moved down? Or, right? And what does it say about what is a chair, right? What is the purpose of a chair if this is what you do with the chairs instead of what you all are doing with your chairs, right? The stories engage us. And this is a really important thing to understand, right? People don't learn things that they can't connect to. And when I say connect, that means both sides of your brain, right? Your reasoning side of your brain and your emotional side of your brain. And I know as scientists that might make you twitch a little bit to think, oh, what do you mean? I don't have to touch those emotional things. But the truth is, if you want people to take with them something important that you want to communicate, if you don't touch their emotions, you will not succeed. So if we take a quick look here, I'm sure by now you've already read the quote that's there, right? If you're sitting in your minivan playing our computer animated films for your children in the back seat, is it the animation that's entertaining you as you drive and listen? No, it's the storytelling. That's why we put so much importance on story. Of course, this is a guy from Pixar Studios, right, talking. And then he says, no amount of great animation will save a story. So I translate that for me as the story is the thing. The quality of that story, and we'll talk about that in a minute, right? That is something that's really important and compelling for people. And without that, all your pretty graphs and charts will not be very successful, if at all. Right? I taught public speaking for a long time. And when we get to the stage in the course where the first thing I do is have them give a speech with no visual aids. And if it were up to me today, we would have no visual aids here. Sorry for the people online, right? So well, it seems worse for them, right? So I always had that first speech, no visual aids. Let's master one part of the whole thing that you got to do, which is standing up in front of the humans, organizing your thoughts, and presenting them in a coherent way. After that, we can get fancier, right? We can add those visual aids. But I would also tell them, if your visual aid fails, you should be prepared to continue your talk. The aids are assisting you. They are not the deal, you are the deal. Right? The story is what matters, what you're helping people to connect. Oh, look, there's been some research about stories. This is from an article I have cited at the bottom of that slide, and I think at the end of these slides I have that on a list as well, just so for your reference point, right? But this one, that what stories can do is that they can increase people's likelihood of remembering information. And let's face it, that is a trick in and of itself. Right? Just getting people to be able to recall information. And if you teach, you know what I'm talking about. Right? How many of you have a habit of starting any class with a reference back to whatever you talked about last time? Right? And then I ask them a question about what I asked them about last time, right? Forcing them, right, to pull that stuff up out of their memories, if it's there, in order to connect the next piece with them. Stories can reduce counter-arguing, right? This might be of some interest in situations where you're presenting information where people perhaps have been exposed to a lot of misinformation or bad information or outdated information, right? And you want them to update their understanding in a new way. Stories can make people feel the experience being described is their own, right? It's sort of almost the definition of empathy in a certain way. And when we connect through empathy in these ways, right, when we can get our audience to feel that empathy, that means that you have built trust in them, and that trust means that they will open themselves up to be persuaded. This is all unconscious, but this is the thread that runs through to enable that to happen better. Right? So one of the things when we teach persuasive speaking, we talk about right away is your first problem as a speaker with a persuasive speech is to figure out where does my audience stand in relation to what I want to persuade them about, right? Are they neutral? Are they leaning towards my direction? Are they completely opposed to me? And if they're opposed, your next challenge is, I got to find common ground somewhere. We got to build that connection. And people often do this, right, through talking about themselves briefly and telling an anecdote at the beginning. That creates empathy for the audience, right? And that opens that door one more time. Stories can be much more convincing than just data. I'm sorry, that might seem harsh or uncomfortable for you, but they really can be way more compelling. And later on this morning, when I talk again, I have an illustration, I think, of how it is that backgrounding the technicality of the data and foregrounding the story can have an impact when you're talking to a general, broad audience, especially when it's asynchronous, right? When you don't control when they see the message. And then stories can increase engagement when communicating science to non-expert audiences, right? And a lot of your audiences are non-expert, not all of them, but a lot of your audiences are non-expert, or they are experts in other areas, which means they are non-experts in your area. And finally, stories do this by tapping into parts of our brains that process information more efficiently when it's presented in a narrative format, especially when that information has social relevance. And I think this is the place where you guys all have value added, right, to the data, is you can look at it and say, wait, I can see what this is saying, what this data is talking about, and I can figure out what that means to somebody else, or could mean to somebody else, and now I have to show them how to do it. So yesterday, I think we heard about narrative arc a little bit, but we talked, right, with the pyramid thing, right, with the steep route, okay, and that poor guy at the end who falls down, right, because it's tragedy. Not all stories are tragic, so don't worry about that, right? But I thought you might find this one interesting in particular. There are a lot of ways to talk about narrative arc and the composition of stories, but this one, because here is somebody talking about it from his own experience as a scientist, right? He talks about this ABT kind of thing, and then he gives this example. I can tell you that in my laboratory we study physiology and biochemistry, but in recent years, we've realized the important questions are at the molecular level. Therefore, we are now investigating the following molecular questions. Right? So it's a long sentence. You might need to pause in there when you're talking to an audience, but right? But how interesting, right, that he takes us from an initial understanding that where people, if you had just started with, we're now talking about molecular stuff, and people are not expecting that, right? You could lose them in that very moment. Mary Catherine Bateson, a cultural anthropologist of great note, and she observed that humans' species thinks in metaphors, learns through stories, right? So what does an anthropologist do? What is an anthropologist studying, everybody? What do they study? Yeah, culture, right? They're studying people in groups and the culture, right? What's happening across those people? What is cohering them? What is helping to create identity? How is it that values are expressed and communicated among humans, right? Not just in individuals, right? And she points from her experience observing many, many different humans, right? This is the conclusion she comes to. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, this idea of narrative as sense-making, a sense-making strategy. You may know Jean-Luc Godard. Sometimes reality is too complex. Stories give it form. I love this, right? Stories give it form. So experience is actually random, and then what humans do is create these social systems to structure our experiences, which helps give meaning, right, to the way we spend our time and what happens to us as we go through our days. Stories is that narrative voice in your head, at the back of your head, that's explaining all the time, justifying, rationalizing for you why I do what I do. Now, most of the time, that voice is way at the back, you're unaware of it till somebody stops and asks you, why do you do that? Why are you going here? What, how did you, with the students, I would say, how did you decide what to wear to class today? And of course, most of them would say, I didn't decide, right? They didn't actually have a plan for what to wear. They said things like this to me. They said things like, well, this was folded over the chair in my room when I got up, and it didn't look too dirty, so I put it on, right? That is not really a lot of decision making. There's no planning going on there. But they invent right, when I force them to, they have to have an explanation, which is itself a kind of story. Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. Hannah Arendt, whose work is fantastic. If you haven't read her, I encourage you to. So here's a little lesson then, right, about this idea about how to tell a powerful story. When she says it reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it, what she's suggesting is that a powerful story often doesn't conclude in a way that answers every question and along the way leaves these, what might be at first imperceptible gaps that people have to fill in for themselves. And that satisfaction of being able to fill it in and get to the next space, that is very engaging. So what narrative is doing overall is providing structure, predictability, understandability, and coherence in our day-to-day experiences, right? So using that method to explain anything else to people, right, seems to make a lot of sense. Walter Fisher is famous for narrative theory. Narrative theory is a thing. If you Google that, you can find all sorts of stuff about it in all sorts of theoretical orientations. But I liked a couple of things about Fisher's version. His key ideas, all meaningful communication, this is quite an assertion, by the way, all meaningful communication occurs via storytelling or reporting of events. So he would take all human communication and put it in that particular basket. And in doing so, right, what he's saying is that there is an overriding function. So whether I'm chatting in conversation casually or I'm purposefully communicating something, right, it's still falling into that basket. Narrative rationality has some characteristics Fisher talks about. For a story to be accepted by people, it must seem probable, it must have coherence, and it must have fidelity. Let me talk for just a moment before we go to the persuasive part again. By probable, it doesn't mean that people cannot accept fantastical stories, because how many of you are science fiction or fantasy fans? See superhero films, right? Like it's all these alternate realities, right? Like we're all, me too, right? But those, when they're good stories, right? It isn't because they are realistic, but because within the frame of the story, the stuff that happens seems probable. It seems like that is the stuff that happens in this universe, right? And we sort of judge all stories in this way. Coherence means within the story, what happens and how people behave makes sense. So even if they do stuff you wouldn't do, you're like, oh, but I see why that character, right? We understand what's happening. And then fidelity, and this one I think is the most important one, but it's also the trickiest. It rings true. But it doesn't have to ring true literally. It has to ring true, right, as sort of springing from human common experience in some way. And that characteristic is the thing that often stories fall down when they're not really well designed, because people are like, it didn't grab me, right? It didn't seem. And then stories are more persuasive than arguments. Now let me clarify. He does not mean arguments in the fighting sense. He means arguments in, this is how we reason. I present a case for something, right? That's an argument, like in the legal sense. So that brings us to comparing the paradigms that I think we're sort of coming to a head about here. One is called the rational human. It's actually called the rational man, but I modified that a bit. Paradigm, and the other is the narrative paradigm we've been talking about. And I think, right, when you feel uncomfortable with story, this chart explains some of that, if you do feel uncomfortable. Rationally, people are rational. This one cracks me up every time. Do you know people who are, it just isn't true. I just don't understand that. I have a story I could tell you later about talking to a behavioral economist friend of mine early in our friendship, when we didn't know each other very well, about him saying, that's not always true. Like, yes, I know. Okay. Decision-making is based on arguments, right? So we get this evidence together, we build our arguments, this is how we should make our decisions, right? Is in this very sort of planned out, careful manner. Arguments need to be sound and logical. They have to use good evidence, right? The evidence quality really matters, right? So we critique that, the source, the quality, how current that evidence is, and we use some formal reasoning to connect those pieces of evidence, right? That's accepted by other experts in the field. And reasoning reveals through logical relationships, the world, the nature of the world or the universe is revealed to us. On the narrative side, people are storytellers and creators. That's how, right, they express and understand the world and themselves. Decision-making uses something called good reasons. And good reasons come from history and culture. They come from character and biography, right? This is a real contrast over with the formality of the other side. Rationality equals internal consistency, lived experience resonates over there, right? That, if it has to ring true for us. And there are many stories in the world. We live in a complex global environment now. Many stories. People choose which story. When you think about the divisive state that our country is in right now, politically and socially, right? People are choosing the stories they prefer, and those stories don't match up very well. So, some implications. Narrative is critical to effective communication. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Stories are the basis of meaningful understanding, and stories connect people, ideas, values, and action. Without touching that emotional value end of the scale, you almost never get action. Finally, people think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. There's a whole area in my field called media ecology, and one famous voice there is Neil Postman. And Neil, who is deceased now, but one of the things that that whole area that he created focuses on is this notion that humans create forms of technology, and then that technology in turn acts on humans and changes how we experience the world and know ourselves. You can think of stories as a form of human technology. They don't exist in the world, we invent them, right? And lastly, I'll mention that science is a story. Some sources. Okay, I think that's enough of me for now. Thank you, everybody, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was awesome. We do have time for a couple of questions, if you're willing to entertain any. Also, she will be speaking again later, so we can also hold for then.
One thing I'll throw out then while people are like, I don't know what to say. I will say, if you think about forms of communication such as advertising and you think about taglines, right? Most of those taglines are condensed stories. Here's a famous example, Nike. What is Nike's slogan? Just do it. And now, all you need to see is the swoosh. They don't even have to put words. They don't even have to say Nike, right? They affiliated, but that phrase, just do it, right? Built into a story through, I want to say 5 to 6 years of commercials that were very explicit about what just do it meant, and then got less and less explicit, but carried the audience, and allows each of us to interpret that slogan the way we want to, and to connect to it emotionally. Okay?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Actually, less of a question and more of a validation of your talk. This is excellent. My coworkers at Unidata know me as a software engineer, but in a previous life, I was an extension climatologist in a red state. So communicating science in a non-science background puts you at odds, especially in a political environment. What I found effective, along with the tools that you provided, was when you walk into a hostile scientific environment, is instead of posing the story, ask the audience to provide their own catalogs for what they've observed, especially when it comes to climatology. It's like, what have you observed in your lifetime? What changes it? And what it does is it provides a segue for communicating the science in a way that they can understand. Great talk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Scott?
get your viewpoint on scientific communication, and I'm not talking to a lay audience, I'm actually talking about with our peers.
Okay.
How do you balance the use of jargon and technical language as a shorthand versus being inclusive to the whole audience?
That's a great question, and I think if I could answer it in a sentence, I'd get a Nobel Prize. But I don't know which prize, but they'd have to invent one for that. But Scott, that is actually a great question, and I work with the Unified Forecast System group out of NOAA in their comms and outreach group, right? And so, but early on, when that was being formed, right, I went to Maryland, and there we all were. There's all these. I'm the only non-scientist, non-physical scientist in the room, and people are standing up and giving these talks. And I'm just going to say Fred. I don't know who it was. I'm like, Fred is up there talking, and he's using words, and I'm just like, whoa. Like, normally I can get the gist of stuff, but I was just like, I don't even know the topic anymore. What is Fred talking about? And then we take a break, right? And so people get up and walk around. My head was hurting so bad, I stayed at the table and kind of was holding my head, and a few other people stayed at my table, and one of them said, happened to be all women, I think, but said, Susan, are you all right? And I was like, oh, I feel like an idiot. I have I don't know what anybody's talking about. But Fred, I really completely lost it. What was he talking about? And whatever, he was using a term, and I said, blah, blah, blah. What is that? And they said, we don't know. And I said, what? Why didn't anybody, I didn't ask because I thought everybody would be like, oh my gosh, who would ask that question, right? Because she's not one of us. So I didn't ask, but I was like, you have no excuse for not asking. You are one of them. And so I think that is a really good question. I can tell you that from Neil Postman's point of view, he's very concerned about clarity in information transmission. And one of the things, he trained his, and I'm friends with his graduates, right, out of New York. He trained them to give talks to avoid language or to always explain when you were going to say something that wasn't. Yeah, and so I think that's well worth keeping in mind, and sometimes I say to people, if you should present some things when there's a mixed audience of any kind, right, a different expert, as though you were thinking a fifth grader needs to understand this, because you're not going to miss most people that way. Thank you.
That was a great lived example of giving an anecdote to tell a story. So thank you, Scott, for inspiring that.